Hi, I'm Petra Popescu, and welcome back to my course on Spring Boot. In this lesson, we will be looking on how to submit information to a controller, either using a REST endpoint, where we will be sending JSON information, or using an HTML form. Spring Boot makes this process very easy, so let's get started. First, I created a simple REST controller, which has one endpoint /users, which is of type post mapping. This means that we can send information using a post request to this controller. This endpoint accepts in the request body, which is identified using the annotation at request body, and accepts one user information DTO. This DTO, if we look over it, has a first name, a last name, and a list of addresses. And the addresses contain city, country, and street. Nothing too fancy. And for this endpoint, once I receive a user information, I return back the same information. Normally, a controller like this will send the information to a controller, to a service, do validation, and maybe insert the user information in the database. But for simplicity, I will only be returning the information which I receive. So using at post mapping, we have an endpoint that accepts a post request, and using at request body, we specify how that request, what the data in the request should be, and using a simple tool, HTTP, I will be sending a post request to localhost/users. My application is already running, and I have a simple JSON here with first name, last name, and one address. If I send the request now, you will see that the information is received exactly as I submitted it. If I do any changes here, you will see that the changes are reflected because this endpoint, and thanks to the simplicity of Spring Boot, we can easily parse the JSON into our data object. In the same manner, we can have put mapping or patch mapping. And again, using request body, we can make it so that the information that we receive in JSON format is parsed into a generic data class. Sorry, not generic, into a data class which we develop. And as you can see, this data class can contain other objects inside it, and Spring Boot knows how to properly parse the JSON without any problems. Spring Boot, however, is much more powerful, especially when integrating with Thymeleaf. I created a simple HTML page. I have a get mapping to that page, which has a form in it. In that form, I have a simple first name and last name. I will be showing how to submit the address a bit later in this lesson. But for now, let's focus only on the first name and the last name. Using the model, I add an attribute to our page named user DTO and create a new instance of the user info DTO object. So now in my model, in my Thymeleaf template, I can access this object. And what I want to do is to bind this form, these two inputs fields from the form, to my DTO object. And this can easily be done using the th object attribute. So Thymeleaf allows us to easily bind a simple DTO class to a form using the th object. This means that inside this form, I have an object which now has no information, and it is binded to this form. And using the th field, I can bind one attribute from this DTO to the input. And bear in mind that for the th field, instead of the dollar sign, we will be using the star sign or asterisk. So now I have binded the user DTO first name to the first input field and user DTO last name to the second input field. I also have one button. And now let's go back to our page. Let's enter my name. And when I press the add user to submit the form, it will go to the post mapping from the same controller. And using the model attribute annotation, I bind the user DTO, so this user DTO object, to an input parameter in my method. And from here on, I can simply use this object. I can use it to do validation, to again store the information in the database or do whatever I want. But for simplicity, for this lesson, I will just send this object to my model so that I can use it as the user info in another HTML file, which just displays the first name and the last name. So now when I submit the user, I see first name Petre and last name Popescu exactly as I submitted from the form. If I do any changes here and submit again, you'll see that first name Anna and last name Popescu was also submitted. So this way I binded my HTML form to an object from the controller and easily receive the information from that form when it was submitted back into my controller using the model attribute annotation. One thing to keep in mind is that we can have information pre-populated. Here I created a new user info DTO object, but what if my object already contains data? So I have user info DTO and let's pre-populate it with the set last name Popescu. And now, instead of sending a new DTO, which is blank, has no information, I send this DTO. I recompile the application, go back to my form, and as you can see, the last name is already pre-populated with the information that I set here. This is very useful for when you want to have your form pre-filled with data to make it easier for a user to complete it. Or even better, when you have made some validations, you want to return the information that is correct pre-populated so that the user doesn't have to re-enter everything. For example, you have a login form or even better, a registration form where you have a name, a first name, last name, username, password, and so on. And for example, the username that the user chose was already used. You don't want to let the user fill everything again. You just want to say this username is already taken, but the information is already pre-populated. So you can just resend this object that you received on the post. And Thymeleaf, together with Spring Boot, will know how to pre-populate all the fields already, because you already have the binding between the fields and the inputs. For this lesson, I especially made it so that a user can have multiple addresses. This is because websites nowadays are really dynamic, and including the forms, which can be easily created with multiple elements that are added or removed at runtime, thanks to modern JavaScript frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue, or maybe even simple JavaScript, we can make it so that the form is dynamic. So we don't know from the start how many addresses the user has, but we want our form to allow us to have multiple addresses. So I made some changes to my page, where now I have a button to add a new address, and whenever I press it, two new fields are added for the city and the country. I also placed a simple breakpoint here so I can show you how the data is added. Moving back to my page, I can now have 1, 2, and 3, and 11, 22, and 23 here. And now when I press add user, thanks to my breakpoint, you'll see that the information is properly submitted, and now I have 3 addresses, exactly how I have in the form. So how does Thymeleaf know how to render the form properly, and most importantly, how does Spring know how to parse the information submitted to our DTO that has a complex structure with a list that can have a dynamic number of elements? For this, we must understand how Thymeleaf binds a form to an object. Moving back to our HTML, you will see that for our address, I created a new simple div, address container, and I added one custom attribute, address count, which is 1, because from the start I want to have at least one input field for the city and one input field for the country. Now, instead of using the h field, I provided the name, and as you can see, the name has a very special structure. This structure represents the name of the attribute inside my DTO, and because it is a list, it has an index 0, and after that, the other attribute, the city, and same for the country. This means that this input will be binded to the addresses object from our user DTO, so this object, and because it is a list, it will be to the first element, indexes start at 0, so the first element in the list, and after that, the element city, so the variable city from our DTO. Next, when I press the add address button, I execute a simple JavaScript function. This is purely JavaScript and it's not the most elegant. It is just for this lesson to show you how you can dynamically construct forms. If you have more experience with JavaScript, you can do it a lot better. So I just get the container for our addresses using getElementById. I parse the integer containing the number of addresses that are already stored. And then I append to the inner HTML the same information as here, but instead of having 0 as the index, I have the number of addresses. And after that, I update the address count in my form. If I go back to my page, go to the HTML and inspect everything, you will see right here that I have addresses 0, and when I click the add address, I have another address 1. Click again, another address 2, and so on. And Thymeleaf and Spring know how to parse this based on the index. And when the form is submitted, let's fill it in again, 1, 2, 3, and 4, add user. And now you'll see that we have exactly 4 addresses submitted. So to recap, binding is done using the name from the input. If we go back to these two input fields that are binded using the th field attribute, you will see that under the hood, actually, we still have name. So Thymeleaf renders the th field as the name attribute. This way, it is very easy to submit a form and to create complex forms that have a dynamic array of objects. You can have multiple objects, you can have nested objects, and if you know JavaScript very well and you know modern JavaScript frameworks, you can submit the forms very easy and create dynamic forms using the same approach by assigning the input name to the object and index from your DTO. And the Thymeleaf, together with Spring, will know how to properly parse it so that when the object arrives in our class, it is properly parsed and contains all the information for which you can then do you can then do validation and save it in the database or do whatever you need from a business logic. That's all for now, and thanks for watching my video. I hope that I'll see you again in the next lesson where we'll be exploring Spring Boot even further.